It's official. The Hannibal Directive massacred Israeli citizens. We don't know the number, but it must have been a very significant one. The Hannibal Directive, coined by Benjamin Netanyahu himself, it is now officially acknowledged, was the reason for many of the dead people who died on October the 7th, which was then blamed on the Palestinians, and the rest is history. And what a history it is indeed. We knew this for a long time. We said it for a long time. I said it in my encounter with Piers Morgan, and he looked at me as if I was a man recently arrived from Mars, and that he could not possibly understand even what I was saying. It's been in the Hebrew press for weeks, if not months, but it's now in the English language edition of the prestigious Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and officially sourced within the government. This is significant not because October 7th didn't happen, not even necessarily because it happened with the Israeli complicity, although it's increasingly likely that complicity to a point was undeniable. It's not to say that there were no entirely unjustifiable actions taken by the Palestinian resistance groups that broke out of the concentration camp on October the 7th. But it is to say that we have been sleepwalked through the last 9 months on a gigantic lie. The clue was in the roofs of the cars in the car park at the Nova Music Festival. All of them had been savagely assailed from the air, and the Palestinian factions had no aircraft. The clue was in the kibbutz houses, clearly destroyed by tank fire, by shells of far greater ordnance than the handheld AK-47s in the hands of the Palestinian resistance factions. The clue was in the number of motor vehicles headed for Gaza with hostages inside them that were attacked from the air and eliminated, on the principle, according to the Hannibal Directive, that no hostage must arrive in Gaza, that no hostage must be allowed to arrive in Gaza, and that any vehicles carrying hostages must be destroyed. That is the Hannibal Directive, and it is now clear from Haaretz's groundbreaking journalism that it was indeed the order of battle of the Israeli forces on the day. That means, Piers Morgan, it wasn't even remotely the largest loss of life in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, even if the Palestinians had done all that killing, but they did not. It's now clear that hundreds, perhaps many hundreds, of Israelis were killed by other Israelis. And it just goes to show that you cannot hide the truth forever. You can keep it in the foreign language press. You can refuse to acknowledge when it breaks into the English language press, as this Haaretz journalism has been completely unacknowledged. There are people in Parliament still chuntering about 1,400 Israelis massacred by Palestinian guerrillas on October the 7th, even though they must now know that many hundreds of those, how many hundreds, we cannot yet know, but we will know, although they buried the cars. Do you remember that? That might have been a clue. They actually interred the cars that they destroyed. They buried the bodies, but eventually someone will succeed in court in disinterring their relatives, and then it will be clear exactly who did what to whom. But the killing in Gaza can now not be gainsaid. According to The Lancet, the world's most prestigious medical journal, not a Hamas journal, not a Workers' Party manifesto, The Lancet. If you can't trust The Lancet, who on earth can you trust? The Journal of the British Medical Association states in its new edition that 186,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and an uncountable number more have been mutilated and maimed. Gaza is the amputation capital of the world. 10 children are amputated every single day in Gaza, oftentimes without anesthetic, all the time without proper hospital treatment. But 186,000 dead is 8% of the Gaza population, meaning that what we were calling a genocide is now officially becoming a Holocaust. Not the Holocaust. On terms of quantum, nothing, one praise, will ever match the Holocaust of European fascism, of the Nazi annihilation of 6 million Jews and millions of others, but a Holocaust nonetheless. If you kill 8% of the population of a territory, then do the maths. Imagine killing 8% of the United States of America in 9 months, in fire and shot and shell. Imagine killing 8% of the United Kingdom, of France, or any of the countries where the audience tonight is watching from. I invite you, do the maths. And then you begin to see the gargantuan scale of this war crime, this crime against humanity, that the world has not just allowed to happen, not just armed Israel to make it happen, not just funded Israel to pay for it happening, but lied and lied and lied by omission and commission about what happened the day before October 7 and every day back to 1948 and indeed back to 1917. But the hue and cry which accompanied a rocket hitting a children's hospital in Kiev just on the eve of the NATO summit was greeted 2 nights in a row with top story status on the BBC. So far as we can see, 2 people died in that children's hospital in Kiev. So far as we can see, it wasn't even a Russian missile, but a misfiring Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile that hit the hospital. Which doesn't mean it wasn't connected to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. This war, which should never, need never have started, is responsible directly and indirectly for every person that has lost their life or their limb in the course of this last 2 years. But it just goes to show 2 things. First of all, even when all experts say it was a Ukrainian missile that misfired, they'll still call it a Russian missile. And even though every single hospital in Gaza has been reduced to rubble, its doctors, nurses, technicians, and patients have been murdered in their beds, murdered at close quarters. Not a single person has called it a war crime or for Netanyahu to be put on trial for committing it. But Gordon Brown, you remember him? Golden Brown, the man that sold Britain's gold reserves at the bottom of the market, was right out the traps this morning saying that Putin should be on trial for the war crime of hitting a children's hospital that he almost certainly didn't hit, which killed 2 people. But the same Gordon Brown has never said Jack SH1T about the 36 hospitals and the thousands of people murdered and mutilated therein. Not one single word. These hypocrites who rule us are typified by the le petit roi, little spring-heeled, elevator-heeled Macron, the would-be emperor of France, has just told the French people that his government is going to continue governing their country, even though they came last in the elections on Sunday. His prime minister is going to carry on. My friend Mélenchon has been told he will never be the prime minister. This is, as Mélenchon just said, unique in the so-called democratic world, where a president comes last, where a socialist comes first, where a right-wing nationalist comes second, orders his prime minister to continue in office. Now, the British people might accept that. The Americans might accept it. Most countries might accept it, but the French will never, ever accept it. Mind you, Macron said all this from Washington. Perhaps he took inspiration from the continued efforts of the naked Emperor Joe Biden to pretend that everything in the Rose Garden is, well, rosy, to pretend that he's still the Democratic Party nominee, even though all the major power brokers, all the big funders are telling him it's time to go, Joe. Hey, Joe, where are you going with that ballot in your hand? Your history, you are bound for endless debates with the nurses in a sanatorium. I wonder if Dr. Jill Biden will visit you when you are incarcerated there. That thought just occurred to me. But one thing's for sure, Joe ain't going quietly. He's not going coherently. He grabbed a mic off a union official today and made a statement, even by his standards, that was entirely berserk. If it had been a scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you would not at all have thought it exaggerated. Joe claims he was the first black woman president and served under the first black president and was the first black woman vice president and was talking to Stoltenberg's wife. I think he said talking to, although if I'd been Stoltenberg, I'd have wanted to check with my wife after what Joe Biden said on stage, welcoming the NATO leaders, the greatest warmongers on the history of the planet since the axis of Mussolini, Tojo, and Hitler strode the stage. There they were, little Zelensky was there, still in that military vest of his, must be smelling mightily by now. Little Zelensky was there because every time he goes to the United States, he leaves with $60 billion in his back pocket. And his cocaine dealer is mighty happy when he sees Zelensky on the stage in Washington. But it wasn't just money he was picking up today. The mighty Netherlands, they've now lost Mark Rutte. He's the new head of NATO. But the mighty defense minister of the mighty Netherlands announced today a huge subvention of F-16 missiles, with which NATO, one by one, are now saying it is entirely permissible to strike inside Russia. The new Labour government in Britain have to get used to saying that. It was not to be outdone. A little indistinguished, inky-fingered clerk of a man called John Healey, former Treasury Minister, unprepossessing 2AT, went all the way to Odessa. I wonder if he knew the history of Odessa. I wonder if he knew how many Jews had been slaughtered in Odessa by the Bandera Ukrainian nationalists with whom he's now waltzing and dancing and financing. I wonder if little John Healy had ever heard of Odessa and its history before. But he went there and he pledged still more money and still more weapons from the straitened British Treasury, where, to quote the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, there's not a lot of money around. Well, there's not a lot of money around if you are a family with more than 2 children. There's not enough money to reinstate your child benefit, which the Tories cut and put a 2-child cap on. There's not a lot of money around if you're in local government, in councils that are bankrupt, literally bankrupt in the case of Birmingham City Council, about which more later. There's not a lot of money around, you see, when it comes to the National Health Service. God bless its cotton socks. There's not a lot of money around in Britain when it comes to transport, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to child poverty, when it comes to low wages, when it comes to student tuition fees. There's not a lot of money around, as Rachel Reeves said. But little John Healy went to Odessa yesterday and banged more billions of British pounds on the desk for Zelensky's coke dealer, his military-industrial complex junkies, hooked on public money, the likes of which has never been seen. Never been seen, the amount of money that's being spent on this conflict. And they didn't just shower money, shower weapons, but they showered a British green light. Keir Starmer told Zelensky he can use long-range British missiles to attack inside Russia. Now, some fools have still not woken up to the incredible danger of this moment. Because I've got to tell you, if I was in the Kremlin, I would treat what Keir Starmer did today as an act of war. And they're lucky that Putin is a much more, how shall I put it, moderate fellow than me. Because if it was me, I would return that act of war with interest. I would make sure that the British people knew that their Prime Minister's escalatory acts were not without cost, and that Russia is not a punch bag. It's not going to be punched around by Keir Starmer. That is for sure. The new Parliament has reassembled. It's not a pretty sight. The grotesque nature of the British electoral system has produced more than 400 Labour MPs. 65% of all the seats in Parliament have gone to a party that obtained just 1/3 of the vote. And if you take out the very large number of people, record number of people, the highest number of people since 1885 who didn't vote at all, then only 20% of the British people voted for Keir Starmer to be the Prime Minister. And yet, in what will become a rubber stamp assembly, he now has the power not just to break Britain, but to take Britain into World War III. I told you before the election that within 6 months of Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister, Britain will be at war. The first shots of that war were fired by Starmer in Washington today. Fasten your seatbelts. It's the mother of all talk shows.